Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Today I want to talk about this. This is the Addlink G55 or the Addlink G55H. We'll get onto that in a bit. This is a new Phison E31 DRAMless Gen 5 SSD, and if you've been following the channel for a while, you know why I like the sound of that. DRAMless SSDs are growing in popularity, and although I'm not a huge fan of them in of themselves, I do like the idea of them in modern deployments. I'm probably never going to use one as a power user, but I do know as an operating system drive now we're seeing more and more Gen 4 and Gen 5 CPUs rocking out the gate of mobile SOC processors. It's actually quite good for some users who want a more curated lane arrangement on their server, on their operating system, their standard laptop or whatever. And that's where this drive comes in. Phison have only recently kind of allowed the E31 controller to go into mass production. It was revealed more than 18 months ago, but it's only in the last few months we've started seeing Gen 5 drives rocking out with that controller. The reason this one stands out is this one is a Gen 5 DRAMless SSD at Gen 5 times 4 speed. No throttling, no bottleneck there. That means even though you're not paying for the DRAM on board, you've still got that controller and the NAND. At 3D TLC 218 layer NAND for that, it's BICS S8. They're on board. And with that E31 controller, this is promoting performance numbers of 10 gigabytes per second read over 9 gigabytes per second write, which again, for a DRAMless SSD, is pretty darn impressive. But let's face it, there are two major problems with Gen 5 SSDs that we've been talking about now for nearly 2 years. Number one, they get hot, and as you can see here, this drive arrives with a heatsink on board. It's actually available to buy without a heatsink. The 1TB knocks around for about $112, $113, and the 2TB rocks around $195. But if you want the heatsink version, you have to spend another $2, and that's it. Now, there's going to be some of you, myself included, who are like, why don't you just rock out the one with the heatsink on board? And as they rightly point out, some people want to deploy this in incredibly compact systems. And even though the heatsink in of itself isn't exactly huge, I can see the logic why they would produce a version that doesn't have the heatsink, because this is phenomenally well attached. It does not come off easy. It's not only standard silicon, but it's also got adhesive as well. This ain't coming off in a hurry. Anyone that saw me doing the A95 Gen 4 SSDs will know the hardship I had getting one of their sodding heatsinks off. So I get why there is an option there. In terms of IOPS, it's reporting 1.5 over 1.3 million IOPS. Again, a DRAMless SSD promoting those numbers, which brings us above and beyond temperature, the other thing that DRAMless SSDs suffer from, and that can often be oversaturation of the cache, and this one doesn't even have cache. So a DRAMless SSD that's going to be reliant on host memory buffer HMB, there is more potential for oversaturation there. So let's tackle those two things about this drive. Number one, let's talk about the performance. We've done our tests first without the heatsink on board. We did get two different SSDs there. So without a heatsink on board, we ran tests in Crystal Disk, Atto and AJA, and some Windows transfer of 50 gig of data. And I'm pleased to say, straight away, performance numbers, great. The performance numbers lived up to that 10 gig over 9 gig. It was only a few megs short on Crystal Disk, and in Atto, which has a slightly different calculation for megabytes over gigabytes, it still did damn well. The AJA testing there as a repetitive test wasn't great, but we were doing a 1 gigabyte 1080i test file there, so we didn't expect it to hit the same sort of numbers. It was able to extend those tests for a good 15-20 minutes without being oversaturated. Again, that's because we weren't reliant on just the memory on the SSD this time, but also, instead we're using the system supported host memory buffer. But do bear in mind that there's been recent reports of host memory buffer support being somewhat complicated, or at least complicated by Windows on Windows 11 in some cases. But it has to be said that without that heatsink on board, I have never ever seen a Gen 5 SSD get hotter than this one. Of course, the reason being, one, it didn't have a heatsink on board, but also it was running at Gen 5 times 4, when the majority of Gen 5 SSDs that are rocking out in the current generation, say the Samsung drives that we talked about recently, the Pro Evo and the Pro Evo Plus, are set to Gen 5 times 2 for that reason, being DRAMless as well. This DRAMless SSD started in the 50 degrees mark. That was me turning the system on, and it peaked throughout the course of my testing at 78 degrees. But the real problem was dissipating that heat. Without that heatsink on board, that heat just wouldn't go down. I left the tests for about 1 to 2 minutes between each test, and the heat dropped 5-6 degrees at most, where normally it would have dropped it in the 10s. So when I went ahead and did exactly the same test, this time using their own included heatsink, I was hoping to see much better dissipation, not just the highs and the lows, but how quickly it got rid of that heat. And I'm pleased to say, did a pretty good job. The highest temperature we saw with that heatsink on board, keeping in mind it's not an active heatsink and there is no cache inside, which means that the SSD controller is going overtime. It wasn't bad. It peaked at 62, 63 degrees. I'm sure you can see it there on screen right now. But what was really important was how quickly the temp came down. Now, obviously I'm running it in a larger system that was inside the Johnsbow N5, and in the Johnsbow N5 mounted on a sister card, there is active cooling, but there's probably going to be active cooling on whatever system you install this in. But it was the fact that that heatsink did a great job dissipating the heat into the ambient airflow in a way that the SSD, without the heatsink to draw it out of it, was able to. The point I'm making is, this is a decent enough SSD. It is, and as a Gen 5 SSD, particularly with that price point, it's not too shabby. But it's the fact that it's a DRAMless SSD for those of you that want those more curated systems. And it was the fact that with the heatsink, it dissipated heat very, very, very well. Also keep in mind that DRAMless SSD do consume less power. I was unable to measure that, and of course we are talking very small numbers, but still nonetheless, it is going to be less power consuming, which means if you're running battery operated systems, or at least higher powered laptops that you might want to run on a battery from time to time, this may well be desirable. But that has been the review of the Addlink G55. There's links in the description to get hold of it for yourself, and hopefully a written review is live, if not now, then very, very soon. If you do want to get hold of this drive and this video has been helpful, make sure those two things are true. There's links to different retailers in the description below that, if you choose to use them, will result in a commission to me and Eddie here at As Compared. It's just us, and it will help us keep doing what we do. So use those links if you can. But otherwise, no worries, and I'll see you on the next video.